Thank you all for coming. I'm Hannah. I'm a postdoc in the IOPPN and a member of the Proudly Kings Committee. I use she/her pronouns and identify as demisexual. My goal for this session is to raise awareness of an often misunderstood sexual orientation. This will essentially be an awareness talk with some opportunities for discussion. For any non-asexuals in the audience, I hope that you find this talk interesting and learn something new. Slight disclaimer, I'm going to speak to my own experiences in places where I feel that examples are helpful, but I am by no means a monolith for asexuality. And for my fellow asexuals, I guarantee that what I present here today won't be anything new to you. However, I hope that by hearing me talk about this topic, I can help you to feel seen, represented, and ultimately less alone. Some content warnings. There will be some mentions of sexual trauma and aphobia. If you feel that those topics will be uncomfortable for you, you are welcome to step away as you need. So this talk will cover Asexuality 101, so we'll give you some key definitions and some overviews of some important concepts. We'll then smash some misconceptions that are commonly had about asexuals. We'll discuss the key challenges for the ace community, and finally we'll discuss how you can create an inclusive workspace and be a good ally. So to begin with some definitions, an asexual, often shortened to ace, is someone who experiences little to no sexual attraction towards others. On the flip side, an allosexual, often referred to as an allo, is someone who does experience sexual attraction towards others. Now, the term asexual is actually an umbrella term. You see, asexuality is actually a spectrum of experiences. Being asexual doesn't have to refer to a complete absence of sexual attraction, though it can mean that for some. There's a lot of variability in the asexual community. If you know one ace, you know one ace. Someone that identifies as being somewhere on the asexual spectrum might also refer to themselves as aspec. So there are some micro-labels that fit under the ace umbrella. For instance, there is grey asexual, sometimes referred to as grey ace or grey A, and this is when someone rarely experiences sexual attraction towards others. We also have demisexual, so someone who only experiences sexual attraction toward others once an emotional bond has been formed. Now, there are actually a lot of other micro-labels out there that someone might choose to use to describe their experience. I've highlighted grey ace and demisexual here because those tend to be the most commonly used within the ace community and the most likely micro-labels that you'll run into, but this is by no means the only ones that are out there. Though I want to stress that when looking at these labels, it's important to remember that labels are tools, not tests. If a label doesn't fit you perfectly, that's okay. Labels are just words that help us describe our experiences to others. Use them if they're helpful, leave them if they're not. And for anyone wondering about prevalency rates, estimates show that between 0.44 to 1% of the UK population is asexual. This comes from the UK census, although other sources do show that this could actually be between 1 to 2%. People can experience lots of different kinds of attraction, including sexual attraction and romantic attraction. Often, people experience both at the same time towards the same people, but sexual attraction and romantic attraction don't always necessarily align. The split attraction model is a model that distinguishes between a person's romantic and sexual attraction, allowing the two to be different from each other and to be directed differently. As a result, someone may wish to define their romantic orientation separately to their sexual orientation, using terms like biromantic, heteroromantic, and homoromantic. So someone might then identify as heteroromantic, asexual, or like me, they might be panromantic, demisexual. Although the SAM originated within the ace community, it isn't only for aces to use. Anyone can use it if they find it helpful. So I do want to give some attention to aromanticism here. So this is when an individual experiences little to no romantic attraction. Someone can be both aromantic and asexual, and this is often called being aroace. However, not all asexuals are aromantic, and not all aromantics are asexual. They are separate things. So I'm mostly going to focus on asexuality today rather than aromanticism because we have a lot to get through today, and I feel that aromanticism might need its own talk. Now, I feel that all this talk of sexual attraction and a lack thereof might feel a little bit abstract, and examples can often help with things like this. So I thought that I'd share my experience of how I worked out that I was asexual or aspec. So the year was 2012, I was 15 years old and the last Twilight movie was just released. All of my friends who were other cisgender girls were obsessed. More specifically, they would talk at length about the franchise's two lead characters, Edward and Jacob, and how hot they looked without their shirts. So I just remember feeling like something was missing. Don't get me wrong, on paper I understand exactly why they were so infatuated with these characters and their bodies. I'm not blind. I see that these are conventionally attractive men, however, I wasn't feeling the thing that everyone else seemed to be feeling. I felt quite outside of all of these conversations that they were having. To be honest, I felt like I was having the straight boy experience when watching these films. To give another example, I used to read trashy teen magazines, oftentimes there would be some full-page photo of a man, some celebrity, often pictured topless like Mr. Justin Timberlake here. I remember feeling quite annoyed actually, like I was being conned out of 4 to 5 pages of this magazine. Now my cousin was the same age as me, and she would cut out these pictures and plastered her bedroom wall with them, almost like some kind of strange shrine to six-packs. It was so strange to me. Why would I want these pictures of strangers on my wall? I remember feeling really alienated and weird. The way my friends were reacting was the expected. It was what was normal, and I wasn't matching up with that. And at the time, I didn't have the words to describe my experience and know that it was okay. So, TLDR, I realised I didn't find Robert Pattinson sexy and based my whole sexuality around that. Okay, so now we're going to look at smashing some common misconceptions about asexuality. Okay, so some people sometimes ask, is asexuality the same as celibacy? Do asexuals all hate sex? And do asexuals just have no sex drive? So, celibacy is a choice to abstain from sex, even in the presence of sexual attraction, whereas asexuality is a lack of sexual attraction and is never a choice. Actually, aces may choose to have sex for other reasons, including, but not limited to get pregnant, to feel intimacy with their partner. Many aces still feel romantic attraction, and sex can be an expression of that. And nice and simple, to have fun. though some asexuals can also live perfectly happy lives without sex, and that's perfectly valid. In truth, aces can have varying attitudes towards having sex, and these will vary from person to person, but they tend to fall into 3 categories, and these categories aren't necessarily exclusive. So the first of which is sex repulsed. So this is when the idea of themselves having sex is off-putting, so it feels kind of a bit icky, as it's always described as. And then there's sex indifference. This is when people are indifferent to the idea of themselves having sex. And finally, we have sex favourable. So this is where the individual enjoys the idea of themselves having sex. So no, it is not accurate to say that asexuality is just when someone doesn't like having sex. And I also want to note that despite how an asexual feels towards themselves having sex, this doesn't necessarily mean that they are anti-sex in general, in the wider society sense. So you might be asking yourself, how can someone like the idea of having sex, but also never or rarely experience sexual attraction? How is a sex-favourable ace any different from a non-ace or allosexual? Well, it's important to remember that sexual orientation is more about attraction than it is necessarily about behaviour. I like to use the cinema analogy here. So in this analogy, having sex is going to be taken as going to the cinema. And stereotypically sexy man traits we're going to take as horror movie trailers, whereas stereotypically sexy woman traits we're going to say are rom-com movie trailers. And please forgive me for the obvious gender stereotyping there. For allos, seeing these types of trailers might make them want to go to the cinema. But that's not true for me or other sex-favourable aces. But that doesn't mean that I hate the idea of going to the cinema. Going to the cinema can be a fun and intimate activity to do with a romantic partner. It's just that seeing a cool movie trailer would never be my reason to go. So, do aces masturbate or have kinks? So sex drive, sometimes also known as libido, is different from sexual attraction. Aces can have a high or low libido or anywhere in between. Some people like to use the buffet analogy here. You can be hungry without being interested in anything that's on the menu. Often aces will describe experiencing libido, but it isn't necessarily directed anywhere. So in short, yes, aces can masturbate and they can also have kinks, but it will vary from person to person. Heads up, the next slide will talk about sexual trauma, and I'll be talking about this for around 2 to 3 minutes. Feel free to step away or skip this section if you need to. Okay, so sometimes people will ask, is asexuality caused by past sexual trauma? So identifying on the ace spectrum doesn't have anything to do with past sexual trauma, and as we will see later, this assumption can often result in aces being referred to psychological therapy unnecessarily. That being said, even if someone does have past sexual trauma, their asexuality is by no means less valid. It isn't necessarily the case that the two are causally linked, and even if they are, that doesn't stop the person from being ace. I really want to underline this because I think it's really important, and I've drawn this quote from the Ace in the UK Stonewall report. So this person notes, I have experienced sexual trauma on more than one occasion, and I must admit that it's been really hard to unpick organic elements of my sexuality from trauma responses. I think that this was one of the biggest reasons that I invalidated myself regarding my ace spectrum identity for a long time. I think that this misconception is an important one to break. Much like this individual here, I also have some sexually themed trauma in my past that occurred when I was around 14, and this made working out my identity really hard. I was under the impression that if the sexual trauma had caused my lack of sexual attraction, then I couldn't be ace, and I would instead just be someone who was broken, forever scarred by someone else. Every time I tried to work out a timeline of when I first noticed my lack of sexual attraction and where this sat relative to events of the past, I had to interrogate painful memories. It stopped me from embracing the label of asexual for many years. If I had known that experiencing sexual trauma doesn't invalidate aceness, it would have saved me years of emotional pain. So another common misconception is this idea that aceness is something that we'll grow out of. Well, people might change how they identify over the course of their lives. Being ace isn't a phase, and there are plenty of older ace people out there. One of the biggest myths about ace people is that they just haven't met the right person yet, which can be particularly damaging to hear. This can come from a place of support, as if it's an attempt to offer reassurance, but it can feel as though you're wishing that we will magically be fixed one day. I have been on this mortal plane for 27 years now, and I'm yet to meet this mysterious stranger who's going to apparently change everything for me. It also can feel quite infantilizing, as if we are all late bloomers. And it also makes it sound like we aren't being believed, that the person assumes that we are confused or naive. And ultimately, would you tell a lesbian that they just haven't met the right man yet? Probably not. So don't say it to us. I actually lost a best friend of 5 years over this one. She was so confident that she knew my identity better than I did, and if I just gave it some time, if I just got some more experience, then everything would change one day. Safe to say, it didn't change. The only thing that changed is that I no longer speak to that friend. Okay, so do aces have intimacy issues? So I would say that there are two main ace stereotypes that you're likely to run into, and I'm gonna take this opportunity to talk about one of them here. So quite recently, a friend pointed to a character in an anime that we both like and said, "Oh my gosh, that character is so ace-coded," i.e. she was saying that they seemed to be asexual. The character in question was apathetic, reserved, deadpan, and this speaks to this assumption that aces are inherently emotionless. But experiencing a lack of sexual attraction doesn't make someone a robot. This isn't helped by the media. Now, we don't have a lot of ace representation in the media, but from what we do have, both canon ace and non-canon ace characters do tend to perpetuate this stereotype. For example, Yolanda from the Netflix show BoJack Horseman is a confirmed ace character. Don't get me wrong, I love this show, but as a character, Yolanda is deadpan and cold. Similarly, folks often assume Sheldon Cooper from The Big Bang Theory to be ace. However, I think this assumption again comes from the stereotype that all aces must be apathetic. This stereotype is also seen for aromantic people. The idea that a lack of romantic attraction means that someone cannot experience love, even though we know things like platonic love and familial love exist. Now we move on to stereotype 2. The idea that all aces are childish, naive, and sheltered. People tend to think that aces are clueless when it comes to sex and sexual attraction. Again, this is not helped by how aces have been portrayed in the media. My example here again is drawn from BoJack Horseman. Todd Chavez is a canon ace character. In general, Todd is quite silly and has frequent nonsensical ideas. One such idea actually leads to him creating a sex robot for his allosexual friend, and this monstrosity is what he comes up with as he claims to be oblivious to sex and sexual attraction. I get that this show is a comedy and it's played for laughs, but nonetheless it feeds into this harmful stereotype. Okay, so it's true that asexuals don't have to look one type of way. Often asexuals are expected to have one certain look, when really there is no one way that an ace should look or present themselves. So Yasmin's an asexual activist, researcher, and model, and she said that there is a certain look associated with asexuality, something between the Big Bang Theory's Sheldon Cooper and someone more homely and frumpy. If you're not sexually attracted to anyone, you're expected to make yourself sexually unattractive. And again, Yasmin has also spoken extensively about the hypersexualization of black people. They don't picture minorities, she says. They don't picture black people. Yasmin has noted that there is an assumption that black bodies are inherently sexual, and therefore she feels that people often refuse to accept her aceness on this basis. It doesn't help that ace spaces tend to be dominated by white voices, thereby flattening our global understanding of the aspec experience. But bottom line, there is no one way for an ace to look. Now, this one may seem a bit silly, but stay with me here. You might have come across the internet meme, asexuals don't like sex. They like garlic bread, chocolate cake, and dragons. Now, I think this did originate from within the asexual community. However, I think that it is problematic because it, again, feels like we're being treated like a child. And it also feeds into this misconception that being asexual just means that you don't like sex, again flattening the aspec experience. So now we're going to move on to look at some key challenges for the ace community. So for this next section, I'll mainly be drawing from the ACE in the UK report, which is a joint collaboration between Stonewall and Yasmin. The report draws from 4 main sources, and these include the 2021 England and Wales Census, the government's 2018 National LGBT Survey, Stonewall's 2022 Rainbow Britain study, as well as a series of focus groups and interviews with ACE people in the UK. To give an overview, the report revealed significant challenges, including probing questions, isolation, sexual harassment, conversion therapy, delayed healthcare, and having their identity treated as an illness. Now the next section will cover some examples of aphobia, and these will last around some 10 minutes. Again, if you need to step away or skip this section, you are welcome to do so. So on the subject of coming out, ACE responses were the most likely group to say that they avoid being open about their sexuality for fear of negative reaction from others, compared to all other survey respondents, and this is coming from the UK government's 2018 LGBT survey. So of those that are out, only 1 in 6 said that they had a universally positive experience of being out, versus respondents from the wider LGBTQ+ community. The ACE in the UK report also noted that participants frequently spoke of experiencing intrusive questions when sharing their asexuality with their friends and family. In particular, one ACE person recalled, "I was quite excited to tell my best friend about it, and her response was, 'Oh, you just haven't met the right person yet,' or 'Oh, it's your medication that's causing it.' Given all this, it is unsurprising then that ACEs had the lowest levels of life satisfaction compared to all sexual orientation groups. Moving on to healthcare then. So 68.6% of ACEs said that they'd never told healthcare staff about their sexual orientation, with around a quarter citing a fear of a negative reaction as their reason for not disclosing. So nearly a fifth said that sharing their ACE identity actually had a negative impact on their care. In fact, it might surprise you to know that asexuality is still a pathologized sexual orientation in the UK under the ICD. So it is listed as hypoactive sexual desire disorder, the definition of which is those who experience a lack or decreased amount of sexual desire either in general or towards others. Given this, it's then not surprising that ACEs are 10% more likely to be offered or to undergo conversion therapy compared to those of other sexual orientations. And focus group participants reported being offered talking therapies and medication to fix their asexuality, with healthcare providers often diverting their attention away from the issue that the participant originally sought help for. Participants discussed feeling as though they weren't believed by medical staff. For example, one said that a nurse had told them, "You're a 25-year-old woman, of course you're sexually active." Participants also expressed difficulty with accessing medical care. One woman who experienced pelvic pain recalled how her GP refused her access to a gynecologist until she had first seen a psychosexual therapist. I can attest to some of the things here. When I was a student, I saw a counselor for general academic stress. In one session, I happened to mention that I thought that I was asexual. I'd been thinking about it again, so I brought it up in passing. Despite us never discussing sex or relationships, her response was, I'm not convinced. And we need to find out what part of your past is locking those sexual feelings for you. When I then attempted to backtrack and shift the conversation back to my academic stress, i.e. the topic that I had actually sought help for, she gave me a look and said, "Hannah, I'm really disappointed in you." I did actually go on to tell her everything about my trauma, and I'm afraid to tell you that Robert Pattinson still looks the same to me. Jokes aside, what she was attempting there could technically be classed as conversion therapy and was not okay. Moving on to education then. So 10.3% of ACE respondents said that they were open with all classmates and fellow students, compared to 26.3% of respondents. When ACE people do come out in education settings, they are the least likely group to say they received only positive responses. And the requirement for schools in England to provide LGBT-inclusive relationship, sex and health education was only introduced in September 2020, and the statutory guidance makes no acknowledgement of asexuality. And indeed, I've pulled a few quotes from the ACE in the UK report's focus groups. So one participant noted, "The message was that everyone's going to have sex. Sex is a natural part of life, and that is basically what my sexual education was. There were no alternatives." So this is speaking to this idea of compulsory sexuality. And again, another quote, "So teachers should know more than just the concept of asexuality, and they should know more fine details, like asexuality is not just not wanting to have sex, it's not being sexually attracted to people." On coming out, participants described in higher education that they were not taken seriously by pastoral support staff. They were simply told, you'll change your mind, you have to find that person, or you don't know, you'll like it when you try it, which again can be invalidating. So in the workplace, just under a half of ACE people said that they were not out to their colleagues versus all LGBTQ plus respondents. And ACEs who do come out at work are less likely than any other sexual orientation group to receive positive responses from their colleagues. Some focus group participants reported sexualized workplace cultures and banter being the norm, which can feel quite alienating. And others said that they faced intrusive questioning and bullying upon disclosing their identity. The Equality Act was created as a single framework to protect against discrimination and harassment on the basis of 9 protected characteristics, including sexual orientation and gender reassignment. Unfortunately, asexual people are not explicitly recognized under the Equality Act, which means that we are not technically directly protected here. Focus group participants reported a lack of proactive information or education on asexuality as part of their employers' workplace diversity and inclusion initiatives. They felt that this put the onus on asexual people themselves to inform and educate their colleagues, but this then sometimes led to asexual people having to field intrusive personal questions from their colleagues, and in some cases led to bullying. I'd now like to speak to how asexuals sit within the LGBTQ+ community. So ACE respondents were less likely to say that they feel comfortable being LGBT in the UK compared to all other respondents. And I believe that there are often 2 reasons cited for this, the first of which is alienation. Queer culture can be quite sexualized, and this can feel alienating, particularly for sex-repulsed ACEs. It speaks to this idea of compulsory sexuality, or that everyone must be allosexual, and that it is impossible to live a fulfilling life without sex. The second is exclusion. So I've pulled a quote from the ACE in the UK report. When attempting to join an LGBTQ+ society, one student was told, "Ace people aren't the same as us. You're just straight people trying to be special. I know you have your issues, but they're not the same as gay people's issues, so you don't belong here." And indeed, after seeing so much discourse online that aligns with this message, I still often feel that I'm encroaching on LGBTQ+ spaces. So finally, I want to end with a discussion on how we can create an inclusive workplace and be a good ally. So what can we do to create an inclusive workspace and be a good ally? I have some top tips here, which are by no means exhaustive. The first, if someone comes out to you as ace, believe them. They know their identity better than you do, and they'll know the intricacies of it. Just take them at their word. Second, read up on ace identities. I've included some resources in the next slide, which are a great starting point. Next, don't ask intrusive questions about a person's sex life. If you wouldn't ask them of anyone else, then please don't ask them to us. It's not okay. Next, listen to them if they wish to talk, and remember all aces are different. Please don't correct them about their own experience. Remember, labels are helpful descriptors, they're not necessarily rigid boxes that we all have to fit into. Don't assume everyone needs sex or romance to be happy. Accept their relationship choices and support them just as you would to anyone else. Remember that aces sometimes often have their own additional identity. For example, I noted that I was pan-romantic as well as asexual. Something to bear in mind. And lastly, call out ace erasure and ace phobia, also sometimes known aphobia, where you see it, and educate others along the way. I'm going to make these slides available, so they'll always be available for you to point back to if anyone needs some educating. Resources here in order to get you started if you'd like to learn more. But as I say, these are by no means exhaustive, and there is a whole plethora of information out there that you can draw on if you're interested in learning more, and I definitely recommend that you do so. We are a very diverse bunch, and there is a lot to learn. Lastly, I want to say a major thank you for taking the time out of your day to hear me out and learn more about this often invisible identity.